forms. From jealous lovers to serial killers, schemers to psychopathic murderers.
My name is Dr. Chris Mohandi. For over 20 years, I've worked as a clinical, police, and forensic psychologist. I've analyzed some of the most violent and disturbing criminal minds. Tonight, I'm going to examine 3 murderers who would do anything for the spotlight. Attention-seeking killers are motivated by an extreme need to ensure that all eyes are always on them, whether that's being noticed by their victims, investigators, or simply vengeance for not getting the attention they feel they deserve.
George Russell posed his victims in elaborate positions because he wanted to be noticed.
It's like watching a movie. You can't believe that that actually exists.
Copycat killer Heriberto Seda terrified people by pretending to be something he was not.
He had a will to kill. At its base, that's how we define evil.
And Dr. Mohandi meets Terry Kaler, a boastful killer with a literal bloodlust.
Then I really bit into his skin. Then I ejaculated when I did, and then I finished killing him.
Using a scale that runs from 1 to 22, from impulsive murderers to crazed psychopaths, the killers will be analyzed to discover who is most evil. For attention-seeking killers, murder is a means to an end. Their true desire is to gain notoriety. Unable to achieve it through acceptable means, George Waterfield Russell turned to murder. He bludgeoned 3 women to death, mutilated their bodies before posing them in provocative positions where he was sure they'd be found.
George Russell was desperate for recognition. Early in his life, he tried various ways to impress people, but when all of them failed, he resorted to violence. I want to discover what drove this insatiable need for attention, and what was the message he was trying to send.
1974, Mercer Island, Washington. From early childhood, George Russell grapples with a strong sense of abandonment. When he is 16, his mother leaves, and he's forced to move in with his stepfather. But the transition isn't easy.
So George's stepfather remarries this white woman. So here he is without his real mother in a family that isn't really his real family.
While living with his adoptive parents, Russell tries to fit in. But his efforts are undermined when he develops an inappropriate fascination with his stepmother. Russell begins spying on her and eventually makes a pass at her. It proves to be his undoing.
So his stepfather had the choice to say either my wife stays or George leaves, and that was no contest. So George was kicked out.
The experience will play a key role in Russell's future crimes.
Nobody loves you enough to take care of you. You must be a monster. So if you're gonna be a monster, you might as well be a good monster, you know?
Early in his life, George Russell made an ill-judged sexual proposition. And I think it was all part of a desperate cry for attention. Well, she rejected him, and that created this intense anger and frustration inside of Russell. It's no coincidence that later in life, the women Russell murdered were all white, attractive, and affluent, just like his stepmom.
1982, Bellevue, Washington. By his early 20s, George Russell's feelings of abandonment have sparked a strong need to be noticed. He turns to a life of petty crime and immerses himself in the local club scene where he becomes a recognizable figure.
I think he loved the nightclub scene because that was his element. He absolutely thrived there because he could be somebody.
A former employee of the bar where Russell spent many evenings agreed to speak about him anonymously.
Everybody thought he was this great, fun, party guy. People just kind of flocked to him, especially the really young girls. He would hang out with the bouncers, kind of joke around with them. They all thought he was great.
George lavishes attention on the women he meets, but not all return his affection.
He just made me uncomfortable the way he talked, and he had really long fingernails, which really bothered me. There was just something about him I just never liked.
Russell maintains an air of confidence, but in reality, any rejection batters his fragile ego. On other occasions, Russell tries more elaborate ways to impress people. One night, he turns up to the bar with a scanner, claiming he's a high-value police informant.
There was two girls there, and his scanner was sitting on the table, and they said, well, we got to be really careful because we're with an informant here. And I'm like, an informant? And they go, yeah, George. And I said, seriously? I go, he doesn't carry that because he's an informant. He carries that because he's a little house burglar, and he wants to know when they're coming for him. And that really angered him.
The insult destroys Russell's facade, and he is outraged.
He approached me and got in my face and pointing at me and yelling at me, telling me I had no idea who he was. You know, he would prove me wrong and that I better keep my mouth shut or I'm going to be sorry.
Staff at the bar try to calm Russell, but he won't back down.
So my boss goes, okay, he's done. He's out. He can't come back. He's gone. He's banned forever.
Russell views being thrown out of the club as yet another rejection, and this one pushes him to his breaking point.
And I remember him yelling at me, I'm gonna kill you, and cursing at me and throwing a scene to where the bouncers actually had to forcibly remove him from the bar.
When George Russell got involved in the club scene, it seemed to be all about getting noticed. He created this striking persona and pretended to be connected, powerful, and wealthy. At the point that his reputation was challenged, he was flooded with all the old feelings of insecurity. Suddenly, this carefully constructed world he'd created seemed about to crumble. From that point on, this driving need for attention was motivated by something else: revenge.
June 22nd, 1990. George Russell meets 27-year-old Marianne Polreich. At first, he's charming and polite. But Marianne turns down his advance. He snaps. He beats the young woman until her skull fractures. Then he strangles her. Marianne dies. But Russell isn't finished.
After she was dead, he sodomized and raped her. I mean, it was all about control. Like, I'm in control now. And you can't say anything.
Russell is exhilarated. To him, the murder is proof that he ought to be respected. And he wants everyone to take note. He drives to the bar he'd been thrown out of a few weeks earlier, drags the body into the parking lot, and carefully positions it. He finishes by taking a pine cone and placing it in the victim's hands.
I think it's something about him wanting to be known as somebody. If I'm gonna kill somebody, I'm gonna make it known.
When George Russell brought his first victim's body back to the parking lot of the club, it was all about one thing: vengeance. I'm not sure why he placed a pine cone in between the victim's hands. It was probably an impulsive decision to make sure that everyone knew that this was an intentional act. In that moment, Russell wasn't just lashing out at the people who threw him out of the club. He was attacking everyone who had ever abandoned him in his life.
News of the murder spreads. Excited by the sense of fear he's creating, Russell begins looking for his next victim. August 9th, 1990. Russell breaks into the home of a divorced mother, home alone with her 2 children. He beats the woman to death. Then, to create the maximum shock, he claws the corpse with his long fingernails and places a pair of red high heels on her feet.
I think what George was trying to say is, I'm gonna be powerful and I'm gonna show everybody. I'm gonna show you how little value you have. You're just a whore to me.
Weeks later, Russell breaks into another house and claims his 3rd victim, a 24-year-old woman. This time, the press gets word and starts running stories about a man attacking local women. Russell delights in the headlines and begins looking around for his next victim. Meanwhile, the police are desperately scouring potential leads. DNA results point to an African-American perpetrator. Then, during a routine conversation with a former employee at the bar, George Russell's name comes up.
The second victim was a good close friend of mine. And the detectives had called me to see if I had any insight onto maybe who might have had a motive to do this. And at that point, I brought up George to them.
When Russell is questioned, he denies being involved. But when police search the car he was driving, they discover blood the same type as Marianne's. And Russell is promptly arrested and charged.
I think that he never liked women, and I think things that happened in his life that affected him negatively kind of created this hatred towards women. And I think that when he got kicked out of his place of comfort where he thought he had friends, I think that just set him off. I think he's very evil. I think he's evil to the core.
It's like watching a movie. You can't believe that actually exists.
On November 27th, 1991, George Russell stands trial. Throughout the proceedings, he appears bemused and detached. In the end, he is found guilty of murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole.
An intense hatred of women, a desire to sexually humiliate his victims, and to shock the people who found them. George Russell is an unusual killer driven by a need for attention. He's definitely evil, but where does he fit on the scale?
Later, Dr. Mohanty evaluates George Russell. But first, he goes face to face with a killer whose desire for the spotlight drove him to commit bloodthirsty acts.
So, when did you achieve orgasm?
As I tasted the blood in my mouth.
Some killers' chief motivation is to be noticed. Killers like Terry Kaler. In 1990, he bludgeoned a hospital worker to death. Then, at his trial, he dramatically confessed to a string of murders that spanned the last 30 years, leaving everyone to wonder whether Kaler really is a prolific serial killer or just someone trying to be famous. In 1999, Dr. Chris Mohanty and fellow forensic psychologist Reed Malloy interviewed Kaler at Sacramento State Prison.
Maybe if you could walk us through, Terry, what it was that got you here.
At this particular time,
Yeah.
I killed a person at the Atascadero State Hospital.
(1990), Atascadero State Mental Hospital, Sacramento, California. 10 years earlier, Terry Kaler was tried for rape and judged to be insane. Since that time, he gives the impression of being a model inmate. Doctors deem him benign, even likable. April 16th. One day, out of the blue, Kaler snaps. He follows hospital worker George Bergstresser to a maintenance closet and beats him to death with a hammer.
And then I tasted and ate some of the blood, and I ejaculated, which is normal.
Now, I noticed that there were like
Scratch marks on his rear end.
Scratch marks on the
Yes,
buttocks.
that's,
Why did you choose his buttocks?
fresh.
Okay. What do you mean by fresh?
It hadn't been touched.
Okay. And you cut, what did you do? Scratch marks or lateral
No,
cuts
they
on
were
the
from an
buttocks?
X-Acto knife.
And it was normal in the context of how you like to be sexually aroused.
That's my, primary. You know, I get the greatest amount of feeling. Yeah.
Okay, is the
And the taste, that's kind of like orgasm.
okay, the taste of the blood, or metaphorically the taste of the
No,
blood.
literally.
Literally the taste of the blood.
Shortly after the murder, Kaler is found clutching the murder weapon and chanting, "I've been a bad bunny."
He was a good guy. He was a good man.
It made it even better, didn't it?
Of course. Doesn't mean I can kill everybody that I like. Don't get me wrong.
Kaler is arrested and deemed competent to stand trial. But during his cross-examination, Kaler makes an unexpected confession. He claims that before Bergstresser, he'd murdered numerous other people. However, he only offers enough detail to raise suspicions, but never confirm any of his actions. In the end, Kaler is found guilty only of Bergstresser's murder and sentenced to 25 years to life at Sacramento State Prison, where he remains. And to this day, Kaler's claims of prolific serial murders have never been verified.
Having spent his life under psychiatric review and in and out of mental institutions, it's tempting to write Terry Kaler off as simply crazy. But after spending time with him, I can assure you, Kaler is anything but. In fact, he is a highly intelligent man, albeit one who thrives on attention. But we do have to ask ourselves, is Terry Kaler telling the truth about his horrid past? Or is this highly manipulative man just trying to get our attention?
(1960). Terry Kaler exhibits deviant behavior from an early age. As a teenager, he commits a string of petty thefts and spends most of his time alone in the woods, crushing ants with a hammer for fun.
I like the feeling of the hammer beating the ants.
But how about the
I know that may be very strange to you, but a sense of power.
Motivated by a need for control, Kaler fixates on what he perceives to be its ultimate symbol, blood.
And then I cut myself, and I don't remember doing what. I'm not sure what caused me or motivated me to touch it to my mouth. And I said, damn it, that's interesting. And I touched it again, and then I got an erection of my own. And I started, you know, both a thrill and chill at the same time.
With no apparent history of abuse, Kaler inexplicably made an early association between blood and euphoria. Even after studying him extensively, I've found it nearly impossible to tell why he developed these tendencies. By my estimation, simply put, Terry Kaler was born bad. From a young age, he embraced dark fantasies that came naturally to him and did not try to resist his deviant urges.
1962. After discovering his autoerotic response to blood, Kaler is obsessed, and he begins looking for ways to feed his burgeoning urges.
I was kind of walking across the bridge, and this boy came up, and he was just wandering across his bicycle, and he stopped and was talking to me, and I had this tremendous feeling, this tremendous desire to crush him.
Were you sexually aroused?
Oh, yes. I said to him, I said, I think I'm going to kill you. It was almost a challenge. And I get down on his neck and bit through his skin. And the more I tasted his body, I had the more feeling of arousal and the feeling of huge power, of strength, adrenaline.
Were you tasting his blood at the time, or was it more the taste of his flesh?
But no, it was the blood. I had to keep biting because it was tough. It was like, it was dry. And once the skin was pierced, I could feel a little bit of the blood, and he started screaming. That compelled me more.
So, when did you achieve orgasm?
As I tasted the blood in my mouth. It's like God has introduced soul, that sense of grace and beauty. Except this would be almost, let's say, devilish.
What were you thinking after you killed him?
Almost a hunger. I wish there was two.
Kaler says he drops the boy's body on railroad tracks and then claims that it's reported as a train accident. But no one has been able to verify his story.
Clinical vampirism is an obsession with blood that can often involve sexual stimulation and arousal. Kaler's clinical vampirism was to a lethal extent. It was all part of his murderous ritual. Tasting blood was sealing the deal, literally possessing his victims in their entirety. Of course, for Kaler, it was all about that ultimate victory and showing the world who was the most powerful.
When we come back, Dr. Mohanty probes deeper into the evil mind of Terry Kaler.
I turned to him and I said, this is really a nice day. And he said, why is that? He said, because I think it's the day that you're going to have to die.
Many attention-seeking killers relish in the retelling of their crimes. For Terry Kaler, his tales of bloodlust are a source of pride. Kaler claims that from 1962 until 1979, He holds a part-time job as a busboy while hunting dozens of vulnerable victims.
People who tended to hitchhike were, especially distances, who were not people that would be missed immediately. And over the years, I took advantage of that.
On one occasion, Kaler chooses a specific male hitchhiker headed for San Francisco.
What were the characteristics that went into selecting him?
He had to have been physically capable of, at least on appearances, that he able to defend himself, because that's part of the physical excitement, that it would be a challenge.
Kaler claims to also relish in the shock value of his intentions. To him, it is a game.
I turned to him and I said, you know, this is really a nice day. And he said, why is that? I said, because I think it's a day that you're going to have to die. And then I said, you either have a choice. I'm going to kill you or you can fight and survive.
And his choice?
And he resisted. He took a swing at me immediately. I was really angry about that. So then I grabbed his hand and threw him on the ground and throttled him, basically.
With your hands?
Yeah.
And as you were choking him, were you sexually aroused?
Yes. Then I really bit into his skin, right on the side of the back of the neck, and where it was very hard, harder than the front, and I just, until I could tear some of the skin away. And then I ejaculated when I did, and then I finished killing him.
Though Kaler says he prefers men for the challenge, he admits to once picking up a female hitchhiker.
Her death was not as satisfying in the sense of her death, but and I will say that she tasted very good to me, and that was satisfying.
Was that the taste of her blood or her flesh?
Yes.
Or her flesh?
No, the blood.
Just the blood.
I truthfully do not like the taste of the skin. Very salty.
All told, Kaler's tales of murder span nearly 30 years, but no one has been able to verify his claims. (1979). After being arrested for rape, Kaler is sent to a mental institution. For several years, Kaler says he's able to satisfy his bloodlust by abusing other patients.
I used to cut a guy on his arm, and then I would masturbate while I, tasted his blood.
With his
fantasy.
With his consent?
Sometimes with his consent, sometimes without.
But Kaler's claims are unsubstantiated. Eventually, Kaler finds that the confines of the institution make it increasingly harder for him to kill.
Was there any kind of tension build up inside yourself that precedes that, goes along with it?
There are thoughts about it, and I would say, damn, I really need to do this. I'm feeling this drive inside. I hate to use the simplistic term, rush, but adrenaline, how about that? The anxiety, losing anxiety. I know that's normally associated with a sense of trepidation or fury, but a positive type of anxiety, of a reward that's over the horizon.
According to Kaler, in 1990, that urge to kill becomes too great to bear, and he strikes one last time.
Terry Kaler has been misdirecting people his entire life. It's his way of ensuring all eyes are on him. Based on my work with him, I do believe he is antisocial, narcissistic, and psychopathic, but he's definitely not insane. Kaler knows right from wrong, and he always has. He is adept at reading people and manipulating them. His tales of 26 murders are rife with detail, and those details don't waver. Whether it was to get out of having to go to school or to land himself in a mental institution to avoid prison, Terry Kaler's end goals have always been served by his utterly masterful manipulations.
Kaler is found guilty for the murder of George Bergstresser and sentenced to life in prison.
You ever feel lonesome?
Yes, very much so, because I live in my own world. I write, I read, and I study, and I play chess in my mind. I imagine myself other people being different, and assuming that they obviously had feelings that I didn't possess. I didn't like that, by the way. I felt that was at that moment, I said, that is not good. For a minute, I said, I should feel bad. Do I feel bad that I don't feel bad? What is wrong? But I don't feel bad. I feel good.
Terry Kaler is one of the most complicated human beings I have ever studied. Based on my experience evaluating murderers, I believe George Bergstresser was not Kaler's first homicide victim. Though we may never know exactly how many deaths Kaler is really responsible for, his thoughts and his urges make him an undeniably evil individual.
Later, Dr. Mohanty places Kaler on the scale of evil. But first, he examines the crimes of a copycat killer.
He snuck up on people, dressed in black, in the dark, and shot unarmed people.
Some attention-seeking killers will go to extreme lengths to be in the spotlight. In New York City, Heriberto Eddie Seda sought recognition by pretending to be San Francisco's infamous Zodiac killer. For 6 years, he trolled the city's streets for victims born under different astrological signs, before savagely murdering them.
By adopting the hallmarks of San Francisco's Zodiac killer, Heriberto Eddie Seda guaranteed that he would get immediate recognition. It was a calculated move on his part, as he knew that people in New York would be terrified at the thought of the infamous serial murderer striking in their city. It was bound to make the headlines, and for an attention-seeking killer like Seda, that is exactly what he wanted.
What fuels a killer's need for attention? And what depths will they descend to in order to achieve it? 1985, East New York, Brooklyn. Eddie Seda lives with his mother and half-sister in one of the city's toughest neighborhoods. From an early age, he develops an unusual obsession with violence.
I believe that was in his teen years. He started to be fascinated with martial arts and karate and ninjas, and he didn't have much money. He could afford magazines, gun magazines, martial arts magazines, things that talked about, soldier of fortune.
In his apartment, Seda makes homemade weapons known as zip guns. And he dreams of being a hero on the battlefield, eventually deciding to enlist in the army.
Initially, he was on the right side of the force. He wanted to join the army, and he wanted to be a commando and a hero, and he wanted to get a gun, and he wanted to be out there and do that.
But to his disappointment, he fails an important psychological test and is rejected.
That was a turning point in his life, because suddenly he couldn't get a real gun. He couldn't be a commando or a hero. So I think he decided to become something else.
Seda had vivid fantasies of himself as a war hero, but he wasn't driven by patriotism or a desire to serve. He wanted power and attention. So when Seda was rejected from the army, that obsession transformed into something new. From that point on, he started thinking of himself as a renegade soldier who was able to operate outside the bounds of the law.
1989. Following his rejection from the army, Seda develops a more gruesome preoccupation: serial killers. Seda decides he wants to become one himself.
He had started watching serial killer documentaries and taking notes, because this is a guy who was making a career choice. To him, I guess it's kind of an infantile way of thinking, but if I can't be a commando, I'll be a serial killer. It sounds stupid, and at a lot of levels it is, but essentially, I think that's what happened.
There is one serial murderer in particular who captivates Seda: San Francisco's Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac tormented people in Northern California throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s.
His particular affinity to the San Francisco Zodiac was, I think, three critical things. I think, one, that he was never apprehended. I think that was a real big appeal. I think that so much romance attached to that particular serial killer that I think that was something that he really, really enjoyed. And the third thing, I think, was that the San Francisco Zodiac was renowned for his taunting of law enforcement. And I think that was something that appealed to his need to get even with society for not letting him have his way and join the armed forces.
I think Sada's decision to become a copycat killer and not just develop his own methodology is one of the most fascinating parts of this whole case. You see, in truth, Sada was crippled by insecurity and didn't believe in his own ability whatsoever. Sada felt that by aligning himself with someone who he perceived as highly successful at what they did, he would somehow acquire that same power.
November 17th, 1989. Sada drafts a letter to the New York police entitled, "This is the Zodiac," a phrase popularized by the real Zodiac killer. In it, he threatens to kill one person for each star sign. But the letter doesn't get the reaction Sada is hoping for.
It was a joke in the precinct. It was passed around. I think it ended up taped to somebody's locker, and it was a gag.
For 4 months, Sada festers, plotting his next move. Then, on March 8th, 1990, he decides to go through with his threat.
His first victim was a man who had worked in Manhattan as a dishwasher. And he came home like clockwork, riding the same train, the same subway every night. And Sada clearly knew what time to expect him, and he was able to prepare himself for ultimately striking him.
Sada stalks the man from the shadows. Then he steps out and shoots him in the back. Over the next 3 months, Sada attacks 3 more people, one of whom dies. Each is specifically targeted because of their star sign, although how Sada learns this personal detail is unknown.
The first 4 victims were mysterious because how did the Zodiac killer know the astrological signs of these victims? Because he's announcing, I'm going to shoot one for every sign, and he was filling in the pie chart.
June 4th, 1990. Sada is determined to be acknowledged. He sends a second letter, this time to the New York Post, claiming responsibility for the attacks.
Eddie was obviously very upset that here he is, he's finally doing his calling. He's a serial killer. He's out there popping people with his zip guns. He's the Zodiac killer, and nobody knows it.
If an attention seeker doesn't get the recognition they think they deserve, they often make direct contact with the press.
This was a pivotal point for Sada. In his mind, he pictured the cops joining the dots and thinking the real Zodiac killer was on the loose. But it didn't play out like that, and for an attention seeker like Sada, that created a dangerous situation. That's because Sada was driven by a desperate need for notoriety. If he felt like that need was not being met, it would likely trigger an escalation in the violence. And unfortunately, that is exactly what happened.
June 1990. At last, people start taking Sada seriously. The newspapers run headlines about the infamous serial killer terrorizing the city. Finally, the NYPD takes an interest.
The police just absolutely flooded the neighborhood. And it prohibited him really from being able to act within that neighborhood.
For 2 years, Seda lays low. Instead of killing, he rats out drug dealers in his neighborhood to get attention. But it's not enough.
Eventually, it's like, nobody knows you're the man. Only you know you're the man. So he's either got to start up or do something else.
August 10th, 1992. Frustrated at being out of the spotlight, Seda eventually returns to his killing spree. His fifth victim is a lone jogger he sees in a park near his home. He fires one shot from his homemade gun, but this time the victim fights back. Seda pulls out a knife and stabs the woman over 100 times.
He had a will to kill. And at its base, that's how we define evil. They like to kill. And that is barbaric. And it is very primitive. And it gets to something very primitive in us. Fear.
When we come back, Seda's need to kill escalates.
A lot of people want to say that evil is not human. Unfortunately, it's all too human.
Attention seekers crave notoriety to the point of obsession. In 1990, seeking the fame of the Zodiac killer, Heriberto Seda became a copycat. 1992. Seda attacks 3 more people, bringing his tally of victims to 8. And the NYPD are no closer to catching him. June 18th, 1996. Seda has a violent argument with his sister.
He fired a shot and pierced her lower back in a handful of places. And those went through and punctured some of her intestines, and in fact was life-threatening. And that started it.
The NYPD are called, and he gets into a standoff with cops. Eventually, he surrenders. He is arrested and taken to the police station, where he is asked to make a written statement.
And he ended the letter with a sort of strange symbol of cross with 7s at the 3 highest points of that cross, and also wrote, "God help me," or something along those lines.
Seda's unusual signature raises a red flag. The statement is shown to a detective who happens to be on the Zodiac task force.
He saw the underlining and the handwriting, and he said, wait a minute, this guy had zip guns? This looks like Zodiac.
Seda is charged and later convicted on 3 counts of murder, attempted murder, and possession of a deadly weapon. He denies being a copycat killer and never shows any remorse.
I don't think he saw any of these people that he wounded, destroyed, hurt in any sort of human context. they were targets to him. He completely depersonalized them.
Part of Eddie Sada's lust to kill, if you will, may have been the fact that we romanticize serial killers in this culture, and it really moves people and scares them. And part of it is, what does it mean to become evil? Why are people evil? A lot of people want to say that evil is not human, that someone is subhuman, and they're not. Unfortunately, it's all too human.
For some attention-seeking killers like Eddie Sada, violence is a way to gain recognition and notoriety. They want their crimes to have wide-ranging impact and are only satisfied when they make headlines. It was as if he felt a greater sense of power with each new story that was written about him.
Driven by a lust for the limelight, some killers will commit egregious acts in exchange for recognition. What motivates these abnormal desires? Dr. Mohanty evaluates 3 attention-seeking killers to determine where each falls on the scale of evil.
George Russell killed and then violated his victims' corpses in a bid to be noticed. It's impossible to ignore Terry Kaler, who claims he murdered 27 people, although only 1 has ever been verified. And Eddie Sada pretended to be the Zodiac Killer because he was desperate for fame. All 3 are attention-seeking killers. But who is most evil? George Russell is a despicable individual who slaughtered women out of a misplaced sense of revenge. But the most unique and heinous aspect of the crimes is what occurred after the murders, when Russell raped the corpses of his victims. Necrophilia is a bizarre form of sexual deviance and is only committed by the most perverse criminal minds. Because of this detail, I placed Russell at 17 on the scale of evil. Eddie Sada went on a ruthless killing spree that left 3 people dead and 5 more wounded. Sada was driven by a desire to be famous, and his victims were nothing more than pawns to help him achieve that aim. The intent with which Sada committed his crimes and the brutal manner in which they were carried out makes him a level 16 on the scale, a vicious psychopath. Terry Kaler claimed he sadistically tortured and then murdered 27 people for no other reason than the sheer enjoyment of it. Taking this at face value, I'd place Kaler at the very highest level of evil on the scale. But we can only substantiate one of the killings, that of George Bergstresser. In that incident, Kaler tormented his victim. It is clear that Kaler enjoys the idea and fantasizes about killing and taking of life. Because because of this, I put Kaler at 18 on the scale. Of these three killers, Terry Kaler is most evil.